So, Don, I was talking about, you had mentioned that there are some nasty parts in Deuteronomy
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
that to modern ears would appear somewhat offensive.
Yeah. I want to get back, if I might. The easiest way to access that point would be to go back to the book of Jonah for just a moment. Um, Even if you accept the idea that the Hebrews came up with something very important, I'm going to make that assumption to justify some such phrase as chosen people, misunderstood as that could be. I don't understand it to mean anything vicious, but rather that they did flatter themselves with the idea that they had come up with an ethical conception of the universe. I call it ethical. It's more than just that. The idea of one ethical God who has in view a world of peace that we are to work out in the future. That's as the culmination of history. That's a Jewish point of view. That in Deuteronomy, you let me put it this way: you can run with that in two different directions. And the world has run with that in two different directions. One is that we have to do everything we can to make this peaceable world by going out into the world of those who don't know this yet, which would mean the pagan world to those people back then. And affectionately, I have to stress that word, spread the word. One alternative would be just to go out and preach the word, this word, to the Gentiles. And the book of Jonah is all about that. That's what God wants Jonah to do, to go to Nineveh, a most un-Jewish context, to preach to the Gentiles, a very sinful city. And lo and behold, it actually, in the story, there's a mass conversion, and God relents and so forth. The one alternative then is to spread the word. The other alternative is to eliminate the pagans, to extirpate, annihilate. I can't use a friendly word about that. And how many times, even in somewhat recent history, by which I mean, for example, the way the New World was taken, did people actually justify basically the total displacement of people and sometimes the massacre of people? All right, so these passages, I actually have my Bible here buried in my briefcase. But there are many passages here, early and late, in the book of Deuteronomy that at the same time as you have expounded this rather advanced law and this rather advanced conception of human existence, that's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have this instruction that where they don't do this, where they don't understand this, you are not just permitted to, but you must annihilate them, and not leave a city standing. As a matter of fact, there's one qualification: you can allow the animals to live, which is very, very stark kind of, wow. Kill everybody. But now you can find these passages for yourself. As I said, I didn't come prepared with chapter and verse. My Bible is in my bag. But you can find these passages in Deuteronomy. And unfortunately,
I actually have an example here with an explanation that I think was very interesting.
Right.
Before I turned your audio on, I was talking about the lack of understanding of, there's a lot of history that's assumed in Deuteronomy. Moses is talking to the people. They're very familiar with the history, whereas someone today who picks up the Bible and reads Deuteronomy would not be familiar with that history nor the culture. Mm-hmm. But this page is Deuteronomy 25:17 through 19. And Moses says, remember what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on the journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. When the Lord your God gives you rest from all the enemies around you in the land he is giving you to possess as an inheritance, You shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. So here, there's more or less a command to blot out the Amalekites.
Yeah, but there are even more explicit passages earlier on where there's no ambiguity about what blot out means.
Well, in Deuteronomy 23, verse 8, Moses says, "Do not hate an Egyptian, because you were a stranger in his land." The Amalekites did more than attack the Israelites once. The attack was successfully repelled. Yet Moses commands, remember and do not forget, but you're supposed to forgive the Egyptians who held you captive. And the track that the person who is interpreting this in the book I'm using takes is there's a difference between a rational fear and an irrational fear. The Egyptians were afraid of the Israelites because there were many of them living in their country, and they were a strong people that kept together. Therefore, they were afraid of the Egyptians, and that constituted a potential threat. They feared the Israelites because they were strong, and that's not an irrational fear. You have someone living in your country who's, even though they're slaves, there's a lot of them, and they can cause problems. So it was not an irrational fear that the Egyptians had of the Israelites. But precisely the opposite was true of the Amalekites. They attacked the Israelites when they were weary, and basically they didn't fight fair. They took the people that were lagging behind and the weak, and they attacked them simply because they were there. And that, he states, is an irrational hate. And his premise is an irrational hate you can't deal with, a rational hate that you can. And to bring this to the present day, it comes down to, what do you do about a bully who wants to bully someone for no reason at all? And the example that's always used on the world stage is Hitler. How do you handle Hitler, who has an irrational hate of the Jews and everyone else and basically wants to kill everybody? Do you negotiate with him? Do you forgive him? And that's a question that still stands today, because there are people around like Hitler with an irrational hate of people. And how do you handle that? Do you simply forgive them and let them do what they want? Or do you have to deal with them another way?
Well, yeah, in the case of Hitler's and so forth, it's quite clear that very, very few of us are willing to go to an absolute pacifism on a point like that. The answer has got to be but the project itself is pacifistic. That's got to be borne in mind. Since Isaiah, the idea is to build a nonviolent world. This is, and to get back to Jesus also, I interpret Jesus as a very radical Isaiah. He is a radical pacifist in at least one sense, the sense that this is the objective of history. Being a pacifist in that sense of embracing it and also embracing methods of bringing peace about does not, however, mean that there are no circumstances in which one would fight. It takes a long time in life to work out these distinctions, but I can't take the position that I would simply allow that bully or a bully nation that has come under the leadership of a madman like Hitler and is now engaging in aggression. I can understand Neville Chamberlain a year earlier trying to negotiate at Munich, peace in our time, he called it. That was an understandable attempt, but it was ridiculed at the same time by a lot of people who thought it was naive, and they turned out to be right. When a year later, Hitler began the actual war. It was just a ploy on Hitler's point. So yes, at a certain point, clearly, a lot of us would say you can't rationally be an absolute pacifist. But yeah, out of this also comes a lot of a subject that has vexed a lot of Christian history, which is the conception of a just war. There's an enormous amount of literature, if you look this up, on the question of just versus unjust laws. A lot of philosophical thinking has gone into that distinction. So at this point, in our thinking about biblical matters, we would at the same time have to get into thinking, if we want to make these ideas real in our own time, what can we believe? What can we do? I think you'd have to think long and hard about some of this just war doctrine that has been developed through centuries and centuries of Christian thinking on the subject, that there's an important distinction between just and unjust wars. Disturbing as that is as a concept. But yeah, to get back to your initial point, Deuteronomy, you still haven't gotten to the truly vicious passages that I was talking about that occur earlier about wiping out cities that don't go over to you, that don't go over to your way of belief. So yes, you have a strong element of that in Deuteronomy. And I believe that Deuteronomy, for that reason, has served as a text for the Judeo-Christian world, sometimes riding roughshod over pagan cultures and wiping them out with a sense of justice that paganism is backward. Of course, there have been others, and here too, the missionary movement has a big stake in good thinking about these things. What is the right way to reach out into the non-Christian world, a missionary would say? And they apparently try for all forms of peaceful teaching. They call it teaching rather than forceful changing of people, or worse.
Well, I mean, if you go back to World War II, which I think most people would say was a just war, the only way you could solve the problem was you had to kill Hitler. You had to go into Berlin, level the town, and find Hitler and kill him. He fortunately killed himself and everything, but Hitler wasn't going away unless you killed him.
Yeah, but what about this thing about civilian populations? That's very good, but you got to get into the nitty-gritty issues here. The bombing of Dresden, for example, which was a non-strategic German city, a beautiful German city that did not have, it had a minor. Yeah, that's where the interest is. Nothing has zero involvement in the war. But it was a terrible thing. And now the issue recurs we read in our daily newspaper about Ukraine. What's going on there? War is one thing, but this destruction of the power facilities, the wanton killing of civilians who are non-combatants. So those issues now arise. So yes, you can justify fighting against Hitler. I do. My family engaged in that too. We were patriotic, and members of my family died in that effort. And yet, one still wonders about what would have been different if we had refrained from the firebombing of residential neighborhoods. The topic shifts at that point, doesn't it?
Yeah, and if you have any sense of history, for America, this idea started during the Civil War with William Tecumseh Sherman.
Yes, the March to the Sea, absolutely. And that total war.
The object is to win.
That's right.
So he notoriously marched through the South and leveled everything that was in his way.
That's right.
And basically he said the object's to win a war, not to play around.
Yeah.
So you have that idea juxtaposed against the idea of a just war. It's amazing how modern day people think of war that's so different than how they thought of it in the past, because the There was an ideal about 2,000 years ago of fighting a war by rules, that war was inevitable. And this comes out of the Greeks. The Greeks had a fighting season, which was in the summer. And the rules were very clear that their Greek warfare was you lined up and you had a decisive battle that was, and basically the winner of that battle, everything was then resolved. You didn't have long protracted wars because it was designed so that you agreed with the other side, you would meet somewhere, and the rules were very strict. You were not supposed to kill women and children. You were not supposed to destroy towns. You were not supposed to destroy the fields so that people would starve. And this is exemplified in the Battle of Marathon. Mm-hmm. That so much of how we think about both war and sports comes out of the Battle of Marathon, where the Greeks came out to meet the Persian army literally in the middle of a swamp. And the Greeks were outnumbered 5-1. And the idea was you had two lines of people, and basically you met and you thrashed things out. Actually, in ancient warfare, very few people died because it was hard to kill someone in these two lines and everything. But at Marathon, the Greeks did something totally, they were outnumbered. So they thinned their lines very thin so they could match the line of the Persians. And they ran to meet them across a stream. And what happened is the Persians broke the Greek line. But in doing so, the two ends of the Greek line wrapped around the Persians and they attacked them from the flanks and completely decimated them. And that's where you get the story of Phidippides, who ran 28 miles back to Athens.
That's right. And collapsed.
After he got to Athens and told the king. Our whole concept of the underdog comes out of the Battle of Marathon. The Greeks should not have won that battle, yet they did. And that's in the act of fighting fairly in a pitched battle is ingrained in the American military and the Western way of war. You're not supposed to damage civilian populations when you're having a war. You're supposed to fight by certain rules. And what was the guy who was in the colonel in the army in our Sunday school class that worked at? He was in our church at Calvary, but he was a colonel in the asymmetrical warfare division. Asymmetrical warfare is when the enemy doesn't fight by the same rules you do. And that's very distressing for Americans because the Americans have this idea that a war should be fought by rules. That's why everyone is so distressed with what Putin's doing. What do you do with someone who you have rules and they don't, and how do you deal with them? It's a basic problem.
Yeah. By the way, there's another example of the underdog that shouldn't be forgotten because it's quite relevant to this discussion. And that's David against Goliath. And what's interesting also about that story is that there was another method of settling conflict sometimes used where a champion, one person, would be appointed by each side to thrash it out. And whoever won the rule, and talk about rules, it was the rule was that whichever champion won, that side would win. So, famously, Goliath is the champion of the Philistines, and David of the Israelites, and the issue is settled. As soon as Goliath falls to the ground, they run off. They're, and not because they think the whole army can be taken by David, but because that's the rule of that kind of combat. Wouldn't it be great to bring back? I'm trying to imagine Biden against Putin. With what kind of weapons would they have? Thrashing. But no, that wouldn't happen anymore. Clausewitz was a 19th century German theorist of war who developed the idea in the 19th century. You're right. Sherman in 1865 marching to the sea. That's quite right. These are clear examples of what's called total war, a complete change, a very ugly change.
One of the first examples of who was the first person to break the rules of war. And it turns out it was actually the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church in France was fighting a group of heretics called Cathars. And the bishop that was leading the fight against them, they met in this huge battle in southern France. And the bishop is recorded as saying, kill them all and let God. Well, his generals came to him and said, we can't tell the difference between the Cathars and the general population, because the Cathars had a belief system and you couldn't tell what people believed on the battlefield. And that's when the bishop that was leading the fight said, kill them all and let God sort them out. So kind of an interesting way of doing this. But,
well, when you get back to your basic question of how do you fight the bully, how do you fight the nation that is a bully, or whatever the case may be, I think we have to get back to thinking about that. There has to be an aggressive kind of pacifism that doesn't perhaps go quite so far as to say that you can't fight back when you have an absolute maniac. But aggressive waging of peace nonetheless has to happen. Something has to happen in history where this becomes a predominant force. I think back of some of the very aggressive. If you go back to Vietnam, and I know you were involved in that period of history, Jeff. If you get back to the reaction of those Buddhist monks who set themselves on fire, this is interesting. They were waging a certain kind of war against war when they were doing that. When you talk about the strategies that people have used in order to wage peace, in order to protest against war and try to do something about it, you can't leave out even these most radical steps that these Buddhist monks were willing to take of dousing themselves with gasoline and lighting themselves on fire. We remember the images. Those of us who are old enough can remember those images. I'm not saying anybody in this room would ever go so far, but we have to talk about what kinds of aggressive peacemaking are necessary in light of all the failures that have happened.
Well, to bring back even closer to Jesus, everyone assumes that Jesus was patently nonviolent.
Right.
And that's true. He practiced I think the Jewish practice of, I think it's shalak. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but it's, you are forgiven by the extent that you forgive your enemies. But this applies to disagreements in, disputes over, you're on my land, or it's a family dispute, or a number of things. Shalak does not address someone who is truly evil.
Mm-hmm.
And look at Jesus and he did wage war against demons. Now, we don't put much stock in demons today, but in Jesus's time, demons were the source of all true evil in the world. Not just bad behavior, but they were the source of evil. And it's documented many, many times in the New Testament that Jesus casts out and destroys demons, because that's the only thing you can do with a demon if you have the power. And they've expanded that into, that could be also attributed to, what do you do with apparently evil person such as Hitler or Putin or whatever? In Jesus' time, they say he was possessed by a demon, and in order to get rid of it, you had to exorcise the demon. Now we don't have demons to blame. Now you just have the people themselves. So the question is, would Jesus have really been totally nonviolent against someone who was murdering innocent women and children by the thousands?
Yeah, I think you have to get back to a discussion of what could Jesus have meant in the adage, the saying, turn the other cheek. That occurs in the gospel in the Sermon on the Mount. But I used to read an absolute pacifism. When I was a younger guy, I used to read that as absolute proof that Jesus was a 100% pacifist who would never fight. I don't read it that way anymore. I read it as a very important counsel that this is the way, in the main, that you are to try to bring peace. Don't respond to violence with violence, at least not at first. Try everything you can not to do that. I would take that to mean. I would also want to look into that phrase, which has the ring of actual historical Jesus speaking, when he says, "I came to bring a sword," rather than so rather than peace in a certain sense. And he talks about setting families members against each other in that passage. What did he mean in that passage? It sounds to me as if it's an actual remembrance of something he puzzled people with by saying one day. And I take it as possible that he did say something like that to say, don't try to put me into any clear basket of those who would never, ever fight. There's a dimension here where fighting is necessary. It has never been sorted out. What the sword is that Jesus is speaking about there is, some would say it's merely a metaphor. Okay, it's possible. I'm not so sure.
Well, we have an interesting part of Deuteronomy here that is talking about criminals. Deuteronomy 25, verses 1 through 3. When people have a dispute, they shall take it to court, and the judges will decide the case, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. If the guilty person deserves to be beaten, the judge shall make him lean over and have him flogged in the presence with a number of lashes his crime deserves, but he must not be given more than 40 lashes. If he is flogged more than that, your brother will be degraded in your eyes. So it's punishment with a limit. Now, we don't beat people today, so that kind of seems out of context, but we do punish them by sending them to prison. But the gist of this is that once you're punished, you need to be restored fully in the eyes of the people around you. In other words, once you're punished, you've been punished, and now the reason why you don't punish someone too harshly is so that they cannot be accepted back into the community as someone who has committed a crime like that should be reaccepted back into society. And it also makes a statement here that the something like robbery or something, restitution has to be made to the offended party. If it was a robbery, then you must give him back his property, as well as being punished by being beaten. But this actually comes from Leviticus 5:23. He shall restore that which he took by robbery. I'm not sure what you do if someone kills somebody, because you can't restore back that person. I'm not sure what happens when restitution can't be made.
No, and they did have the death penalty. They clearly did use the death penalty for certain kinds of things, for things much less than murder, unfortunately, so that there are elements of the legal code that instruct stoning to death. You see these scenes of stoning to death occur in the New Testament. Paul, early on, before his conversion, is witness to one, and has said he was approving of this, so that it's not just execution. It's actually execution by a very strange method where the community stones to death by the instruction of the law in the Bible. If you go through Leviticus and portions of Exodus that contain the law, you'll see how many different offenses actually were that came with the punishment of stoning to death as the method. So yes, another practice that we would not have. It's important to attach these texts. A text like Deuteronomy is a text that is attached to the King Josiah of the late 7th century BC. That would be around 620 BC, where apparently there was a campaign against hostile populations. Then again, later on in Jewish history, under the Hasmoneans, 2nd century BC, where we get the Hanukkah story and all of that, there was another nationalistic. There were wars of aggression committed in the name of our law. So this is what Jonah stands against. You convert the world to ethical enlightenment. You don't annihilate the shrines of these people. So that when you go out into the world, this apparently was taken literally by some people. When you go out into the world and you do encounter pagan religions, we call them pagan religions, you don't kill them for being pagans. You don't even eliminate their way of life. You try to engage in dialogue with them. I don't know, Jeff, you guys had more missionary experience than I did, and I take it that you weren't religious missionaries in the sense of talking doctrine, but nonetheless, the missionary movement is based on a lot of this thinking. You are a missionary. You're not a soldier. It's a very important distinction. You're to go out into the world and bring enlightenment, interact, dialogue with them.
That's exactly right. The stance of the Methodist Church is the purpose of a missionary is not to convert. It is to share.
That's right.
In other words, you go on a mission trip, usually with a purpose, like you're going to build something. We went down and we built churches when we were there. We also did things like
right.
Bible school for the kids in the town. But the training course I went to before we went down there made it very clear you are not going to convert these people. You're not going down there to turn them into Christians. You're there to share your beliefs and everything with them and then just let it go. Many missionaries from other sort of places go down and get a body count. It's like, we're going down and we're going to convert X number of people. Almost like what you see in the huge revivals here, Billy Graham or whatever. There's how many people come down for the altar call? We had 10,000 people come down for the altar call. No one says what happens to those 10,000 people after they leave the building.
Right.
It's all how many people came down. And that's not how the Methodist Church views it. I guess that's why we don't have altar calls. I haven't been to a Methodist church yet that's had an altar call. But the idea is you go down, you share the love of Jesus with them, you help them out, you do things. Now, we were in an area of the Dominican Republic that was all Pentecostal. So there was, we weren't going to convert them to Methodists, that's for sure. But we were not in the position that everybody that we were there with was pretty much a Christian in one form or the other. That wasn't true when we went to Africa. But I was rather surprised with how the Methodist Church views missionaries, is that we're simply going to share and help them out. And we don't worry about whether or not you've converted them or anything like that. You just go down there to share and then come back, which I thought was rather interesting.
If you go back to the 15th and 16th centuries, where you have the Spanish conquistadors on the one hand, but you also have a Spanish missionary movement. Some very enlightened people were involved in that missionary movement who were brokenhearted by the events that actually happened. Cortez in Mexico is a clear example of that. Could these things have been avoided? Could the whole nasty business of our, what I mean is European culture's interaction with the Indians, the Native Americans, could it have been different? We can't pretend that there were not those at the time who criticized the methods that were actually used. There were people who understood that this is not how to behave, who were genuine missionaries, who wanted to set up missions to help people, as you say. This is 500 years ago. But their hearts were broken by the way things actually turned out. Could they have turned out differently? Could the interaction between European culture and New World culture have been quite different? Well, I don't believe in determinism in history. In other words, I don't believe that whatever happened had to have happened. I don't believe that. No, and I think we have to rethink that. We can't do it all over again. Whatever tragic things have happened, well, they have happened. But thinking them over can be very, very useful as we go into the future about avoiding mistakes that we don't want to make again.
Well, we got an interesting, when we went out to Hawaii, we took a bus trip up and biked down Mount Haleakala. And a guy that was with us gave us the lowdown on Christian missionaries in Hawaii. So it was not pleasant. They outlawed the language, they outlawed the culture, and basically it was King Kamehameha's wife after King Kamehameha died. It was one family that did the work, the Baldwins of Boston, who make the pianos, the Baldwin pianos. They sent their family over as missionaries, and they talked King Kamehameha's wife out of all the land. So the Baldwins own most of the land in Hawaii. One of the reasons why when you buy a house, you're leasing the land, because you can't own land in Hawaii because it's owned by someone.
That's true.
It's interesting. Anyway, we're at an end here. And Don, thank you again for joining us. Sorry, I totally forgot about turning on the audio.
Well, greetings from Wall Street. I am at the corner of Wall Street and Water Street in New York City as we speak. I'm with my family. We had a wonderful time on the Staten Island ferry and walking up to Chinatown and Little Italy yesterday. And so we're having a family time. It just turns out that this hour during the morning worked out. Right now, I'm going to have to pack my things together and get going for the next part of the day. I'm very, very happy that I was able to work it out to see you guys again. Will you be meeting next week?
Yes, I'm sure we will.
All right, good. I'll talk to you during the week then, Jeff.
All right, if I can have us out here.
Good to see all of you guys.
For this message.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
It takes a lot to look at the word and see how we think and how we need to think in a different direction, Lord, because the definition of insanity is to keep doing things the same way over and over again and expecting different results. We also take into account that there are things in the Bible, Lord, say we shouldn't do, but we are allowing our government, the secular society, push us in that direction. Lord, we'll do what we can, and that's all that we can do, to plant seeds to people so that they realize